It is highly recommended to use Azure Managed Identity in an AKS Azure Kubernetes Service cluster. Within our cluster, we might have one or many managed identities. One of them would be used by the control plane in order to create the resources for my cluster, like creating the virtual machine scale sets, the node pools, creating the virtual network, the subnets, creating the public IP, the load balancer, and then we might have other managed identities that will be used by the node pools themselves or by the pods deployed into these node pools, like a managed identity in order to connect to the ACR, the Azure Container Registry, to be able to authenticate to get the images and deploy them into the cluster. If we enable some other plugins like Container Insights in my cluster, that will go also to create its own managed identity and use that identity in order to authenticate to the Azure Monitor to send the logs and metrics there. Another plugin that we can use is to connect to the Azure Key Vault to get the secrets from there and consume those secrets from our pods, and that's using the Secret Store CSI driver. And the list goes on and on. For connecting to an Azure storage account or to a blob fuse, we can use also another managed identity for that reason. Historically in Azure, when we wanted a service to authenticate or to connect another service, like for example a web app that wants to connect to the storage account or the key vault or a database, we started first by using the SPN, the service principal, that is an application in the Azure Active Directory, and we give it the right access role, and then we use that SPN within our Azure service. So that SPN did have a client ID and client secret, that is a secret value that should be kept secure, and it did also have an expiration date. So those were some of the issues when using SPN, because I need to rotate and I need to renew that service principal credentials. So for that reason, we have invented, or we have come up with another solution that is using the managed identity. Managed identity behind the scenes is an Azure application, but you don't manage the expiration date for it, so it will be renewed automatically. And there are no credentials to secure, so it will not give you a secret value that you should keep secret. And the managed identity will be managed as an Azure service, so it's like the service principal as a managed solution. Of course, today we recommend to use the managed identity in any Azure service. Many of Azure services already support it, and one of them is AKS. So AKS have support for that managed identity. So when I have here my AKS cluster, I would have the two parts. So first of all, I would have my control plane or my API server. So this is at the end, it's a virtual machine or one or many multiple machines where we would have the Kubernetes components running here, like the API server, as I said. And then on the other hand, we would have that control plane that will be connected to one or many other worker nodes. So here I would have my worker nodes. So those are at the end my Kubernetes nodes. So I might have one or many. And I might have also one or many worker nodes or many node pools. So let's think of this first one as, for example, this is the system node pool, and the second one is user node pool. That's our recommendation today, to use system node pool for system pods like the core DNS and so on, and the user node pool where you would deploy your own applications or your pods. So in a second, I will tell you why I have draw these two separate node pools as separate workloads within my cluster. So my pods will be deployed into those system user node pools. So here I might have one or multiple pods, and the same here inside the system nodes. I would have also some other pods, but those are the system pods. My cluster, when I create a cluster by default, AKS, the service itself, will go to create those components for me. The control plane, those virtual machines. It will go also to create some other resources like load balancer, public load balancer. And then that load balancer will be attached to this user and the system node pool. And with that load balancer, I might have also some other resources attached to it like public IP, In addition to that, I might have some other resources attached, like the Azure disk or the Azure file share for managing the persistent volumes and so on. It could be also a blob attached here and use it to persist some data. In addition to these, if we create a Kubernetes cluster by default, there will be a managed virtual network created by default. Of course, you can bring your own virtual network, but by default, it will create one for you and it will manage that VNet. It will create and it will attach those VMs to that virtual network. It will create the different subnets and so on. So there is lots of resources that gets created here, but the question now is who is creating those resources? So it's the AKS cluster. It means that's a part of the control plane, one of the control plane components that is actually the cloud manager. So from here inside that control plane, we would find a component called cloud manager. And that component actually will go to provision those different resources. But that component needs needs to get the right access role in order to create these resources in the customer subscription. So it's the customer who will give it that role. So by default, when I create the cluster, this control plane, or as part of my cluster resources, it will actually go to create a service principal by default. Now, as we move to the managed identity, we would see a managed identity that will be created by default for you, and that is a system managed identity. If it's a system managed identity, you will not see it as part of your cluster resources. You can query the object ID of it, but you cannot see it in the portal. However, you can also bring your own managed identity. So you create a user managed identity and then you attach it to your cluster. And you can do that part prior, before creating your cluster. So here we would have a managed identity for the control plane. So this managed identity will be used by that cloud manager, and mainly so that's will be used by this one. This control plane will need, of course, the right access roles, the airbag roles on the resource group or for the cluster in order to be able to create those different components. So it will need mainly the contributor access. So with that role, it will be able to create those different resources. However, sometimes it will need more than the contributor. It will need the owner on some specific configurations. So that's the first managed identity used in my cluster. It's managed by the user. So it's the user who will go to manage that identity, who will go to give it the right access role. And then when we create the cluster, we can configure that control plane to use this managed identity, this exact managed identity. In addition to this, we have a second managed identity that will be created by default in our cluster. This identity, we always see it inside the node resource group for my cluster. And typically it's called like agent pool dash identity, something like that. So this managed identity will be attached to the system and to the user node pools. So all of those nodes right here, they will use that managed identity. But for which reason we have this managed identity? So we have here actually another interesting component in the Kubernetes and the AKS ecosystem that we didn't mention it here, and that is the ACR, Azure Container Registry. That's where I will save my container images right here. So ACR needs the right access role from my Kubernetes cluster. So this pod, in order to get this pod from my ACR, I will need the airbag ACR pull role in order to get that image down to here. So this means here, by default, we will see the role airbag ACR pull. So then this managed identity will be used by here. But inside here, the component that will be using that managed identity is the kubelet. So for that, we call it actually the kubelet identity. Yet we still have some other managed identity that could be used within our cluster. So when I want to use the Azure monitor in order to get the logs and metrics from my cluster, here if I would have my Azure monitor, with this solution I would have some pods deployed for Azure monitor inside my cluster, and those pods, they will need to collect the logs and metrics from my cluster and then send it to Azure Monitor. And for that reason, they will need to authenticate and authorize. And then the solution here would be natively to use another managed identity to authorize to send those data into the Azure Monitor. So from here, I would have another managed identity in my cluster, and this one will be used for Azure Monitor. Yet we still might have a fourth managed identity in the cluster. Of course, those identities will be created when we enable the Azure Monitor add-in into our cluster, the Container Insights feature. A fourth identity could be used for lots of use cases when we use Kubernetes cluster, when we want, for example, to save secrets or private certificates into Azure Key Vault. So here, if I would have Azure Key Vault, then with Azure Key Vault, if I want to access it from my AKS cluster, I might be using the plugin Secret Store CSI driver. So I enable that plugin in my Kubernetes cluster that will go to deploy some pods here, and then those pods will try to connect to that Key Vault. So with CSI Secret Store driver, it will have actually lots of options for connecting to this Key Vault. Either it can use the existing managed identity, this kubelet managed identity, but we don't recommend that. We recommend to keep that kubelet managed identity, only use it for connection to the ACR. We should not give it more access roles than it have already. The second option would be to use service principal, and we don't recommend it. We want to use managed identity. Then it can use actually the user assigned managed identity, and that's where I will go to draw here another managed identity. This one will be used for Key Vault. So that managed identity would have the right airbag role for Azure Key Vault user or secrets user in order to get access to the secrets inside this Key Vault. And by the way, for the CSI driver now it have a new solution to connect to the Key Vault, and that is using the workload identity, which will be using the managed identity with federated credentials. And here, those are the main, let's say, main four managed identity we typically use, but we still have lots of other options, for example. So if I want to connect to an Azure Blob Fuse, for example, so the storage account for Blob Fuse actually supports also a managed identity that I can use it with it right here. So that will help me to connect to that blob using a managed identity. And some other scenarios actually could also include the Azure Application Gateway. When we use the Azure App Gateway with the AGIC, with the Azure Application Gateway Ingress Controller, that means we would have here a pod inside the cluster. That pod will need to connect to the Azure Application Gateway instance in order to apply the ingress configuration into here. So for that, it will pass here, it might pass through a managed identity through the way. To recap here, we would have the main and the most important managed identity for my cluster, that is the managed identity for the control plane. This one should have the right access role to create all of these resources. That includes also creating the managed identities itself. So it should have that right for managed identity operator, okay, where it can create those resources. It should also have the right access role to create the virtual machines, the virtual network, the disks, the load balancer, the public IP addresses, and so on. And then on the data plane or on the worker nodes in my cluster, I might have one or at least one managed identity created by default for connecting to ACR, and then another managed identity to connect or to send logs and metrics to Azure Monitor, to get secrets from Key Vault, and another one to connect securely to our Blob Fuse in Azure storage account. Now here I'll go back to where I have said from the beginning the reason why I put here system node pools and user node pool. So the reason here is that for this managed identity user to connect to ACR, we need to get the Docker images from ACR in both user node pools and system node pools. So it's normal that this managed identity for Kubelet would be assigned or will be attached to both node pools. The same will apply for the managed identity for Azure Monitor, because we want to send logs from both node pools, because we would have actually pods deployed in user and system node pools, and they will also send the logs into the Azure Monitor from both node pools. For the managed identity for Key Vault, however, things might change. So it depends here where I have that application. If I'm deploying a system pod into the user node pool, and that system pod needs access to that managed identity, then I will bind that managed identity only to that system node. And note here, we can actually use even many managed identities. If I have, for example, many Azure Key Vaults, for each one I would create its own. I will create for its own managed identity and then bind it to the right node pool. So those are user managed identity. It's up to me as a user to choose to where to attach that managed identity. However, now if I have another case where it's my application who will need to access that key vault, and my application will be deployed into the user node pool, in that case I will bind or attach that managed identity to only my user node pool, not to the system node pool. And the same here will apply for the managed identity user to connect to other Azure services like the blob views. Thank you.